Ladies and gents, welcome to the Shroom Light podcast. Today, I have a guest, Will Kitching, and he's a keen fisherman with a YouTube channel, fishing in southeast Queensland, and he's also a writer for Fish and Boat magazine in Queensland, and he also does talks on how to target certain species in the fishing clubs in and around that area. Today, he's generously sharing his knowledge on how to catch snapper along the east coast of Australia and also various reef species. He's going to be sharing his extensive knowledge in finding, capturing, and landing these particular fish. So I'd like to welcome him to the Shroom Light podcast. So how you going, Will?
Hey Shroom, how you going? Thanks so much for having me, mate. It's a pleasure to be on here.
Thank you. I'm really excited to have you on because this one, a little bit different, and I know a lot of the people that listen into the podcast are looking for snapper tips. Snapper, definitely one of those species that has high value in terms of being really good on the plate, and also it's just something a little bit different as well. You generally have to go off the coast to get a quality one, at least in Sydney or even further up north. So let's just start off by introducing yourself more fully to the audience. I've said a few things about some of your accolades. So how'd you get into fishing? Did you start from a young age or were you a late convert?
No, I definitely started from a young age and I fell in love with it really quickly. So I was really lucky that my dad loved to fish and started going with him, and still most of my sessions to date are with him and my brother sometimes. So that's how I got into it. And in recent years, I just keep falling more and more in love with it. So that's probably a lot of the viewers and yourself.
Yes, it certainly helps that dad and brother, definitely probably big addicts along with you, and just having someone to share these moments with is something special. And I think like a lot of people that did get started at a later age, they didn't have that family member or close friendship group that really were enamored by the sport of fishing, but really it's just something that I couldn't live with, and it sounds like it's just something that's just captured your imagination from a young age. Now, what sort of fish were you catching back then?
Well, I started off just sort of in the estuaries catching, your typical whiting and flathead, and still to this day, they're some of my favourite species to catch and keep for a feed as well sometimes. But then obviously you move into, as you get older, you want to catch some bigger fish. So you target your jewfish and, snapper that we're talking about today, and heading offshore and chasing all those reef species. And, you get into your pelagics like mackerel and, all that sort of stuff. So I'm pretty much everything from whiting to marlin. I just love to target. So probably like a lot of fishers, to be honest.
Yeah, I think as they say, variety is the spice of life. And like you mentioned a few species there that I'd like to get my hands on. Jewfish, always. It's just something that I've always put time into. I've never caught a Spanish mackerel, so it must be pretty crazy up that way with the action that you get.
Yeah, definitely. We're quite lucky here to have a good mixture of northern species like that and then southern species. So in the same day, we can be catching mackerel and then go and catch some snapper to finish the day off, or jewfish or whatever. So we're very lucky here, both in the estuaries and out on the reef.
Like you said, as we're going to be discussing more about snapper, at what stage were you being converted into sort of targeting them? I mean, it sounds like you do have a few species that you focus on, but definitely, like I said, a lot of anglers like to catch snapper, and it's just something that you probably put a lot of time into.
Yeah, definitely. Well, snapper, when I was younger, before I was going offshore, Dad was doing it with his father and my uncle, and they'd go out and catch snapper. But then when I got old enough, probably when I was around 12 years old, say, I started going out there. But we just sort of fell in love with them, firstly because of how fun they are to target and chase, and the fight that they produce, but also they're one of the best eating fish that we get here. So when we're looking for a feed, that's definitely the type of fish we target. And in recent years, as I've got older, it's been really good to fish for them, with Dad, and learn more and more about them and get better at targeting them. So that's been a really fun thing to do with Dad and some mates as well that like to target them.
Right. Now let's move forward to the current time, and that's talking about, say, your latest trip, gone for snapper. So how did that go?
So funnily enough, Shroom, our latest trip that we had for snapper was actually the best trip that we have ever had. And that was due to, firstly, the quality of fish we were getting. we got good numbers, but the quality was just the best that we've had. They were all really large fish. They were really fired up, and yeah, we had a really, really good morning. And it actually was through a little bit of planning. So we did a trip about a week earlier, and we just missed the end of the bite, and we found an area that was holding a lot of snapper. And a week later, we planned a trip, made sure that we got there at the right time, and had a bit better preparation. And yeah, it ended up being the best snapper session that we've ever had. So it's funny you asked that, because yeah, our last session was actually our best. So it's crazy how once you start to learn a species, you can slowly get better and better and have better sessions.
Yeah, that session there definitely would be a mark in your memory banks that would stay there forever. And actually, I just wanted to ask you about that sort of trip. So obviously, having had a time when you went out and didn't find the success, but pretty much narrowing it down to probably a factor or two factors that, affected your results, and then coming back with that factor in your favor, that's just changed your result.
Yeah, yep, definitely. There's, as we'll probably talk about throughout the podcast, there's a few certain factors that you can narrow it down to that are really going to increase your chances.
Let's just talk about snapper as a species. So far, the one that I've mentioned so far has been their value in terms of being a table fish. But, how would you describe snapper and maybe the way that they behave or look? Just something about their anatomy sort of thing that most people wouldn't know.
Well, I mean, it's probably not something that most people wouldn't know, but if you look at them, they're a type of fish that is a real predator, opportunistic feeder. So they're going to feed anywhere from the bottom up to mid-water, and even on the surface if the water is shallow enough. They feed right up in the water column. And if you look at their tail, I was watching a fishing show recently, and they talked about the tail. It actually looks like a pelagic's tail. And it's because they feed, so high in the water column at times. And some people will catch them right down hard on structure, but a lot of the time when we're catching them, you get them up feeding around bait a long way off the bottom up in mid-water column. So that's a really interesting thing, and really helps when you're trying to target them as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I never noticed the shape of the tail being more of that pointy sort of shape. As they grow older, I guess. I don't know whether that's sort of how they are when they're young, because down in Sydney, you get a lot of the really small ones, the pinkies.
Yeah.
And they pretty much look like red brim, really, but we're talking some proper snapper here. And I haven't caught a proper snapper, but now that you mention it, that is definitely something that makes it interesting. Because, like a lot of people do think that you'd only get them pretty much on the bottom of maybe broken reef sort of structure in deeper water.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the downfall of a lot of people up here. Like with the reef fishing up here, a lot of people, and myself included when I first started, they think that the paternoster rig and getting your bait down right near the bottom is the way to go. But a lot of the time that subtle presentation and floating it down through the water column slowly, you can still hit those fish at the bottom if you make it down there. But a lot of the time those fish are actually feeding up higher. So with the paternoster, you miss them, and often you miss the bigger fish if you use a paternoster and just rock it straight to the bottom.
Yeah, that's great. That's just sort of setting the tone for this podcast. So we'll definitely talk about ways to get them in terms of baits and rigs and of course lures. We're not limited to what we can discuss here. But before we get into that, is there a species that you have on the bucket list that you'd like to tick off? I mean, being up in Queensland, you have quite a wide variety. You've got your northern species coming down, and you've got a little bit of that tail end from the southern species as well.
Yeah, well, that's a tough one. But I think, to be honest, I think the main one at the moment would have to be Red Emperor. Just they're a bit similar to snapper, I guess, in a way, but just the fight that they produce and, sort of places you're going to go to target them and the different ways you can target them now. A lot of guys are getting them on jigs and stuff. I think that'd be a really cool fish to get.
Yes, I've seen how. I mean, they look majestic, if there's a word to describe them.
Yeah.
Again, another top table fish. Probably one of the best. I think a lot of people claim that they're at the tippy top pointy end Now, in terms of those reef species, so that's obviously one that you haven't caught yet. Are you in those areas that would allow you to get a red emperor, or they're a little bit further north from where you are?
Well, it's a bit funny. We're just right at the southern end here in southeast Queensland. So I fish a lot off the Gold Coast, but we don't really get your tropical reef species there. You know, you get your snapper and pearl perch and Maori cod and things like that. But you start getting into the sweet lip and all that sort of stuff more up in Brisbane North, so the Sunshine Coast, a couple of hours north of here. And people do get coral trout, really good coral trout, and legal red emperor there, but they're just few and far between. So they're more bycatch when you're targeting other species. But when you start getting up to Fraser Island, that's where they really start to get a bit thicker, and people actually go out and specifically target them. So we're right at that southern end, but there's still some unicorns out there, and it's really cool seeing people catch, you know, your red emperor and legal coral trout and stuff like that.
Yeah, that would explain it. It would be quite a low chance, and like you said, sort of a unicorn to catch him, but you wouldn't rule it out. On a good day, you might come up tight to one.
Yeah, definitely. It sucks when you get them, you know, 2 centimeters undersized and you have to send it back. But it's good to see them down here anyway, and hopefully the population grows as time goes on.
Now, relating to this would be other reef species. So what sort of other bycatch would you say you regularly get, and that you sort of have developed a knack of sort of targeting them? Because we are going to be talking a little bit about that as well, along with snapper.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the main ones are pearl perch. We get those in the same places that we get the snapper a lot of the time. And then, as I said, as we go a bit further north off Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast, you start getting a lot of grassy sweetlip, which are, once again, a great fighter. They go really hard to get you in the bottom, which is really good fun, and they're a beautiful eating fish, even your tusk fish. And, you know, as I said, you always get other species like Moses perch, Maori cod, other species of cod, and there's always a chance of, you know, your coral trout and things showing up as well. Rarely, but they do, yeah.
Awesome. Let's just move on to the next question before we get right into the meat. So we talked about bucket list fish. Let's talk about a capture, a snapper. Is there a story behind the particular capture that you'd like to describe? On this podcast, I love stories, so anytime you can tell a good story is exactly what the viewers want to hear.
All right. Well, the one that comes to mind actually is one from last year off the Gold Coast. So Dad and I had a little snapper mark, and we actually hadn't fished there before, and we'd had it for, I think, 10, 15, 20 years even. And one day the weather was not good enough to head out wide, so we just stayed right in close. And anyone that watches my YouTube channel would know that it's right in close, and a lot of people try to figure out where it is. But we were fishing there, and I ended up getting busted off on my first drop on the reef. Lost another rig to snags, and then all I had was just a rod with just a single hook, and I just put a half pilchard on there and dropped it down and put it in the rod holder while I tied another line. And all I did was sit down to get the leader out, and it just started screaming off. So in the most unexpected way, I landed the biggest snapper of the day, and that was up close to 70 centimeters. So it's just amazing. You know, elephants eat peanuts, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's quite a story there. So, like, a lot of people believe that you have to go offshore into deeper water to catch snapper. Like, I don't target them, but I did get one time. With my limited experience, I was chasing jewfish up the river in the Georges River. We're talking brown water. We're talking many kilometers up the brown water where you could even catch EPs and bass. And I caught like a near 45, 50 centimeter snapper.
Wow.
It's insane. Yeah, that blew my mind. I haven't caught a single snapper within 5Ks or I don't know, maybe even 10Ks of that place ever since. So I don't know how it got there. I don't know what it was doing, swimming in it was basically rock and mud bottom. So that's
Yeah, wow.
the sort of river that we're talking about here, and that's what I caught. I mean, it was one of those days where we had a week of incredible rain and incredible like winds. It was like cyclonic sort of style winds, you know, when the system just gets battered left, right, center, up and down. And I think the fish just didn't know where it was going. It just sort of got lost.
Well, it's amazing. That's why fishing always amazes me, because things like that happen and it just seems unexplainable sometimes. But this similar stuff happens up here. Snappers show up in some of the weirdest places, and it's just amazing what fish can do.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Look, there's so many ways that we can take this podcast right now. I guess what we'll start firstly with is, you know, let's just talk about general sorts of structure that you might find them in, sort of thing. Yep. Like you know, someone that's trying to look towards starting their account on chasing a snapper. What sort of things would you recommend that they look out for?
Well, the first thing, the sort of places that you're going to find them, for starters, would probably be a good one, so people actually know where to start looking. It depends on the season here, but in winter up here, and you know, the northern part of New South Wales is when they move in close. So we get them in places like Moreton Bay, right up in the shallows. But they also come right in close off the coast onto the close-in reefs, only a few k's out. In summer, they're still available, but they push out a little bit wider into 50 metres of water plus, and they're definitely hanging around reefs a lot here. I mean, you find them on structures like wrecks as well, but a lot of the time it's just reef, and it's the gravelly parts, I guess, off the edge of the main reef structure where a lot of people say they find them.
Yep.
What I really love is finding lumps of reef and pinnacles or bommies, and a lot of the time we find them, hanging pretty tight around those. So whether it's just because it holds bait or deflects the current, I'm not sure, but that's the sort of areas. And then the next really big thing to look for is bait. So all of my decent snapper sessions that I've ever had have been finding bait and fishing that. So, some people find them where you just have the snapper stacked up on the sounder, and that's really good. But I find it a lot easier to catch them when you can find big balls of bait sort of sitting just up off the bottom or on the bottom. So they're the two really big things to look for, and that I look for is the pinnacles of reef, or where the reef drops off onto a bit of gravel, and then the bait is a huge one.
Yeah, so obviously knowing marks and using your sounder to locate little increases or changes in depth, that's one of the keys to being successful with snapper, you'd say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it doesn't have to be a huge bommy or anything like that. It could just be where, the reef rises up a couple of meters and then flattens out and then drops off again. They're really good spots. But yeah, then there's also marks that I have that are just on a general reefy, gravelly sort of area, and all we do is look for bait and try and stay on top of it.
Yep. What about your view on like habitats that say, broken bottom? Is that sort of something that you work on, or you're just looking for those pinnacles and bommies most of the time?
Most of the time I'm just looking for the pinnacles and bommies, but I don't have a really fancy sounder or anything like that, but you can obviously see where the bottom's harder and where it's a little bit softer.
Yep.
But yeah, they're all good areas, to be honest. Snapper can show up anywhere in those areas, and I think the main thing is once you find an area that's holding them, which it might take you a couple of trips. Once you do find that, they're going to come back there time after time. So.
Yep. So there's a few things there that you mentioned that I'd like to expand on, and the first thing is bait, the presence of bait. Is there any sort of specific type of bait you'd like to see?
To be honest, there's a main one that I like is when the bait is actually really balled up, which with a lot of species is the same. It really shows that the snapper are feeding, and some sort of fish has pushed those into a ball. When it's really flat and spread out across the bottom, we don't seem to do as well. But there's days where you might be struggling to find bait, and if you do find a show on the sounder, you just have to fish it, and where there's bait, you're always a chance of a snapper being around.
Yeah, makes sense. And also, shallow water snapper. So what sort of structure in shallow water are we talking about here? As in shallows in what sort of depth?
Well, to be honest, the shallowest that I've ever caught them is, I think, 6 meters. So in that sort of area, it's a totally different type of fishing where you're sort of anchoring and burleying, whereas out on the reef, I prefer to drift most of the time. You can still anchor and burley out there, but in the shallows, you're finding places where there might be a really heavy reef and it drops off into a bit of gravel where the snapper are going to be feeding. And 6 meters is a pretty good depth for me up in the shallows. And as I said, anchoring and burleying and then just floating your baits and lures out.
Let's talk about baits and lures at this stage. So Will, would you like to talk about baits first or lures first?
I'm easy. I mean, it's a similar way of fishing, to be quite honest. It's, we can talk about baits first. We'll do that just to start off, and then we can get into lures.
So let's talk about baits, since that's going to be quite interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So for baits, what sort of baits are we talking about here? Just types first.
Types of bait. Okay. So a very popular one here is pilchards. They're a good starting point, and that's what we use most of the time. But you can also use squid, which I like the whole larger squid. You can also use liveys like yakkers and slimies. They're a good bait, especially for the bigger fish. And another one that we love is strip baits. So strips of bonito where you've cut it into a thin strip, or you might take the fillet off a slimy mackerel and just put the whole fillet down. Things like that. They really like oily baits and flesh baits. Even if you catch a grinner or something like that and take the fillet off, they absolutely love it.
Yeah, okay. Let's go through some of those baits there. So pilchards, whole pilchards, you're putting down to the bottom, and does it have to be any specific type or brand, or does it have to be fresh?
Yeah, fresh is definitely the best. We just use tweed bait, which we have at all of our service stations and bait stores up here usually. But if you can get fresher bait from your local tackle store or whatever, it doesn't really matter, to be honest. But you sort of want good size pilchards. You don't want really small ones. The individually frozen ones are usually the ones that we get.
Yeah, so down over here, obviously, pilchards, even if they go off, they seem to do well on catching the bait fish here. Yeah. So that's why I asked whether, fresh does matter or not. So, I know the yakkers go insane for stinky old 3-day in the car boot pilchard. Oh, it's crazy. It's just, it's insane how hard they go on that. And if you get fresh pilchards, it almost seems like you don't even have any bait on the hook sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, who knows? It's probably good up here too, because snapper do really like that stinky, oily sort of bait. And, I caught one recently, and when we filleted it, it had a bird wing in it and bones and stuff. Well. So I don't know if it was a chicken or seagull or what the heck it was. But yeah,
it probably nailed a seagull off the top, I'd say. I mean, that's just a pure guess here. I mean, I wasn't there. I mean, I wouldn't be David Attenborough with a camera along the coast just filming. Have you seen that? That slow-mo vision of GTs nailing birds off the surface.
Yeah, it's insane. It's amazing how well they can see them, and they have a crack at them, that's for sure.
That's insane. Now, would you say that's the number one bait, fresh pilchards?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, the only problem with pilchards is, as a lot of you might know, is they're quite soft. So if you're fishing in a place where there's a lot of pickers, as we call them, or smaller species, and that bait's getting down near the bottom, that's where your bigger flesh baits and squid can be better, because you could send a pilly down there and you get 2 small bites from a yakker or something, or probably 100 yakkers picking at it, and it disappears, and then you have to wind up, and you're just wasting heaps of time and bait. So if that's happening, it's better to try the bigger flesh baits or a whole squid, which is tougher for them.
And how would you rig a pilchard? With gang hooks or?
This is the important part. So you can use gang hooks, but I like to just use a snell rig. So just 2 hooks snelled or snooted together with the bore sinker sitting right on top. So I've just been using 4-0 hooks, just normal octopus hooks, not circle hooks. But I think I'm going to actually start using 5-0, just because when we've been hooking bigger fish, we've either been pulling hooks or, having a few problems with that. So I think I might actually up the size of my hook. So yeah, 5.0. A lot of people use that, and that seems to be really good. And the good thing about that is, compared to gang hooks, is because there's that bit of line in between the hooks, your bait can look really natural as you float it down, whereas gang hooks, it can often be a bit stiffer. And as I said, just a ball sinker running straight on top, and you want to use, you probably heard it, a lot of people say this before, but you want to use the lightest weight possible to get down, because snapper, especially the bigger ones, they're going to feed as that's dropping down, and that's when you're going to get 99% of your bites.
Right.
When that bait's floating down.
That's interesting. I've watched a fair few videos in my time, mostly of Melbourne snapper, and that they like using squid, and hearing pilchards doing the damage, that's just, it solves one problem, and it's the fact that pilchard is just so much easier to obtain than some fresh squid, really. Like, in my opinion,
definitely.
It's just more economical. You get so many kilos in a bag.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we usually take 2 bags out. I think, I don't even know what size they are, probably 2 kilos of pilchards, and you get that many baits, and you can keep them cool and refreeze them if you need to as well. So it's really good.
And that makes sense why you prefer fresh bait as well. Fresh bait, it's that soft, flippy, floppy sort of. Like, I'm just imagining the pilchard now. You know exactly what it looks like when it's fresh, and when it's like gone off, it's sort of like shriveled and sort of stiff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, another big thing that I'll mention is, I found with the snapper here, obviously the pilchards are just floating down, but if you're using squid and stuff, it's good to still have the head and tentacles on there. And snapper really like that wafting action, and a bit of dangly sort of stuff, and that applies for lures as well, which we'll talk about soon. But I see a lot of guys down south, in Port Phillip Bay and stuff like that, or down in Sydney, where they'll just use a squid ring even and catch fish. But up here, it's a lot more about the presentation as well when you're fishing on the reefs for the snapper, in the deeper water. So that's a really big thing. You want that nice wafting action.
What about the use of maybe Lumo beads? Is that a thing for you?
Yeah, some people do. Personally, I don't. I know some people use it specifically just to stop their sinker smacking against their knot and their hooks as well. But I've never used it, and never really had a problem. But who knows? I might try it one day. I know a lot of people use what we call flasher rigs, where you have, or I think, Black Magic used to have a snapper snatcher rig sort of thing. It's a bit similar to that, where there's a bit of tinsel tied on the hook. They seem to work well too, but I just keep it as basic as possible, and just 2 hooks snelled together, and the sinker running straight on top, and it works fine.
Yeah, it makes sense. Those hooks, I haven't used those flasher ones before. I always thought of them as looking like oversized sabiki sort of hooks. Like that sort of look. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, knots, any specific knots that you use, or you think any knot will do the job?
To be honest, I just use.
So you snell one of them.
Snell.
Yeah. So snell both, or just. Yeah.
I just snell the top one, and then the bottom one I just tie on with a blood knot, or if you want to use a uni knot, you can do that. The only other thing I'll say is, when you do rig your bait up with it, you want the line between those 2 hooks to have a tiny bit of slack in it, just so it doesn't, make your bait curled up or too tight.
Look like a banana on the way down.
Yeah, exactly, because it'll spin and won't look natural.
Yeah, so any sort of spinning, you would just re-attach the hook on the bait, or maybe even start again and set that distance at a longer length.
Yeah, well, I always start with the top hook, and I put that through the nose or through the eye of the pilchard, or through the top of the squid, whatever you're using.
Yep.
And then I'll just line it up. So I'll pull it tight, the bottom hook tight, and then just bring it back a tiny bit, so there's just a bit of slack, and then put it through. So usually that makes it a lot easier.
Now, we'll talk a little bit about the squid as well. So squid, what sort of squid? So here we get, bottle squid. We've got, the ones off the trawlers, green eye, arrow. which are quite expensive, and then you can also get, I think, some imported ones, which they call Lund squid.
Yeah, well, Lund squid, that's the one that I was going to mention. That's what we usually use. But if you do catch like smaller fresh squid, we've caught fish on those as well, floating them down, and they seem to absolutely love those, actually. Even when the fish is a lot smaller than it should be for eating that size squid, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. What sort of cuts do you take out of the squid? You're not sending them down whole, are you?
The Lunds one, we just send down whole.
Yep.
If we get a bigger squid, the head is often a good bait, cut in half maybe.
Yep.
Or if you catch just a really small squid on your jig, you can just send those down whole as well if you want. And just make sure that the snapper really eats it before you set those hooks, if it's a little bit bigger squid.
Oh, right. Yep. Makes sense. So you give it a few seconds before you lift in, sort of thing?
Only if you're using a bigger squid. But often, if you're just using pilchards, as you're floating that bait down, which I'll talk about the technique soon, often they'll just come up and absolutely smash it. And as quick as you can, engage your reel and set the hook is as quick as it takes. You don't need to let them eat it or anything or swim off with it. They just absolutely smash it.
And also about the squid, you don't use rings, do you?
No. So I see a lot of people, down south using just the rings or, maybe just strips of squid. But I think it's just because it's a different style of fishing where, they might be setting the bait and the fish are finding it. Here it's often, floating down on top of their head, and it's a lot about the presentation as well.
Yep. Yeah, I'm starting to get a feel for that right now, just the way that everything's being presented. Definitely down south. I don't know if people use whole squid all that often, but definitely you see so many people use them stripped up or in rings.
Yeah.
Just really prepared squid. It doesn't look like a squid. It's just like squid flesh, but very clean cut sort of presentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen on YouTube videos and things like that where people use a ring and then maybe a tentacle off the end or something, and it doesn't look like a squid, but it has that scent. But here, I think, we could put down a big ball of bait or something like that, and it wouldn't really get touched. But if you put down a nice presented bait, it does a lot better. And it could be because there's a bit more fishing pressure here, and the fish are a little bit smarter. You need to get all those 1%ers right. But
yep.
Yeah, I don't know. I just find that a really well presented bait is very important as well.
Now we'll talk about one more bait of your choice. So you mentioned, for example, strips of. No, I got the wrong word. I'm thinking sergeant bait, but you were talking about lizard fish, and I forgot the word that you used for lizard fish.
Yes.
Grinner. That's right. Grinner, strips of grinner or slimies, yakkers. So what's another bait that you want to talk about? Just one more.
One more. The last one I'll say is I'll say bonito, because often we get those as bycatch fishing around the bait schools, and you can strip those up. But bonito seem to be a really good bait as well, because obviously they're a tuna with that nice oily flesh, and they're nice and soft, so you can still take the fillet off it and then cut that into nice thin sort of strips with a dangly tail, and that's another really good bait that we find, and we've got a lot of good snapper on that as well. And even cobia and things like that tend to hit all these baits. So bonito is another really good one. If you can buy that from your tackle shop, or if you catch one out there, just take a fillet off it.
Yeah. Now let's move on and talk about lures now.
Yep.
So for lures, there's probably many different techniques and ways to get them. We're talking probably deeper water fishing, so probably we're talking soft plastics with a bit of lead. I think, at least I've had one podcast where jerk shad seemed to be the go in pink, grey and pinks. Sorry, pink, grey and pinks, of course. I said pink already twice. Pink, greys, whites, that sort of natural colour presentation is sort of taken a really gentle finesse approach, because they were drifting as well. So, and that person that I'm talking about is Scratchy or Jeff. So shout out to Jeff. So how's your approach go?
Yeah, well, soft plastics are definitely my favourite, and I think for people that want to get into targeting snapper on lures, they're definitely the best way to start and most efficient, I'd say. So it's funny that you mentioned that because I actually steer clear of the jerk shad style. We have used those in the past and caught fish. They definitely work, but I just find that the paddle tails are really good, and also the curl tails, because obviously, as I said with the baits, they have that nice wafting action to them. But the jerk shad's are definitely good, especially if you're actively fishing with that rod in your hand.
Yep. What sort of plastics are we talking about here? Like, what are some examples of paddle tails and wrigglers or curly tails?
I really like the Z-Mans, just because they're so tough, but also because of the colours as well that they have. They just seem like really good all-round plastics. So the one that I really like is actually just a 3-inch minnows paddle tail.
Yep.
And as you said, the pink colour, it's called Pink Glow. For some reason, pink is just one of the best colours for snapper, especially in the offshore scene. They are just unbelievable plastics. But we have several trips where we go out and we might use the same plastic and catch fish on it, and it just keeps going. They're so tough. And as I said before, with the pickers out there, if you're using things like, I don't know, maybe a gulp or something, the tail can get bitten off and you might not even know about it. So you could go a whole drift and you're not even, fishing with your tail on your plastic. So that's why the Z-Mans are so good. And that one would definitely be my favourite, the 3-inch minnows.
Yeah, I think that one there actually does glow in darkness, so that might give it an edge as well. But it sounds like you are a believer in colour making a difference.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we used to use a sort of a greenier coloured one, and we used to catch the odd fish, but we changed to pink one day just to give it a try, and the results were amazing. And we haven't looked back since because it just keeps working. And it's funny, even in, you can go from the dirtier sort of water in close where it might be a little bit green out to 20 kilometres and fishing in crystal clear water, and the same colour still works. But if I wasn't using the pink, I'd definitely steer for a more natural colour, like I think they have the Opening Night, which is more just a bait fish colour.
That one there is sort of a clear with silver glitter and a purple back. I think it's a purple back. Yeah,
that's the one.
Yeah.
That's the one.
Just for those viewers that don't know, what the colour looks like. So that's sort of how it looks. Yeah, it definitely looks like a lot of bait fish, like a lot of flickering and sparkling.
Yeah, definitely. And even in dirtier water, I mean, you could even try a bit darker colour, like maybe a motor oil or something like that. They definitely work. So, yeah, the pink work. I would tie the pink on first, no matter where I was fishing, whether it was in close to shore or 20 kilometres offshore in cleaner water. But out there, the Opening Night also works well. But if you're fishing, I know some people get them here in Moreton Bay, which is a bit dirtier water. It's more an estuary with reef in it. The darker colours would work fine as well.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. So in terms of action, how would you best extract that out of those lures?
Well, it's funny. There's a couple of different techniques, and one of my techniques always seems to shock people. So once again, the snapper love to feed on the drop. So when I say on the drop, I mean as that lure is sinking down. And that's also why I love a soft plastic with action, with a tail action. So a lot of the time it's a cast up the way you're drifting. So you're going to be drifting towards where you've just cast and just letting it sink. And once again, with your jig head, you want the lightest possible for where you're fishing and for the conditions. So you want that plastic just floating down on their heads, and a lot of the time they'll just hit it as it is sinking down on their head, and the line will either start peeling off your reel and you have to engage it and click it into gear. But another technique that I love to use is while I'm fishing with bait, we'll just have a plastic dead sticking out the back, so in the rod holder. We'll use the same technique. We'll cast it up the way we're drifting and let it sink down until it's, down in the zone, I call it, which is, 10 to 15 meters off the bottom. And then we'll just click the bail arm over on the reel and engage it, and put that in the rod holder, and it'll sort of bounce around with the waves and the boat, and often it gets hit like that as well. And there's days where we get more fish on that technique than with the bait, which is amazing.
How heavy of a lead do you use? So it sounds like we want to use as light as possible to get it down. So we don't want an anchor.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's obviously going to depend on where you're fishing, but and the conditions as well. Like if you have a bit of wind pushing you along, often you need to up the size of your jig head just to keep it down there as you're drifting. But, I'm fishing 25 to 40 meters, say, with a 3/8 of an ounce jig head. You could even go a quarter if you're in really shallow stuff. And then as I get out to, maybe 40 to 60 meters of water, I might up it to even a 3/4 ounce. But
Yep.
I start the lightest I possibly can, and then if it's not getting down there, I might have to change to, say, a 1/2 ounce jig head, and just keep upping it. Or some days I might think, I'll need a 1/2 ounce, and it'll be sinking down too quickly, and I'll actually back it off and get more bites that way. So I might start with a 1/2 ounce and drop it down to a 3/8 if I think I can.
Now, about curly tails, is that also with the Z-Mans?
Yeah, still the Z-Mans. I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of other brands work, but I just prefer the Z-Mans just for their toughness with the snapper, because they're such aggressive feeders, and as I said, you might get the tail bitten off other brands, whereas the Z-Man, at least you're going to know that you have your tail still on. Like no smaller fish is going to bite it off and you won't know about it. So yeah, the curl tail and the Z-Mans are also good.
Is there a plastic that you use if the bite is shut down? So say the pink paddle tail isn't working, which is obviously a big problem at that stage. That's sort of your go-to by the sounds of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's another plastic called the scented paddlers from Z-Man, which has scent already on it. I mean, you can put scent on all your plastics, but they come with scent already on it. So they're a good one, and often get the fish a little bit more interested. And the curl tails are another good one, because you can fish those a lot slower if you have to, and still get that action out of them. And it has that nice wafting action, as I said, which can sometimes be the difference of enticing a bite.
So also a small size, around 3 to 4 inches? Yeah,
I usually fish with anywhere from 3 to 5 inches, so 3 being the smallest, which still catches good fish, and then the 5-inch or 6-inch being the biggest, and that'll still catch all sizes of fish, but often it can entice the bigger ones if they're around.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense.
The other thing I'll mention is, you talked about the jerk shad style. So they're often good if you're casting. So if you're in shallower water and you're casting up drift and letting it sink, and then, actually jigging it and retrieving it back to the boat, they're often good, because with the rod in your hand, you're usually using a much more aggressive action. But they can also be good out in deeper water if the fish are a little bit shut down and you're trying something, jigging it a bit harder through them to try and get a bite out of them.
Yeah. So it sounds like you have very subtle technique. You're just trying to work that bottom third of the water column, so to speak.
Yeah, and sometimes it can almost be like finesse fishing, where you know that they're down there and they're looking up, waiting for something to drift down to them, and all you're doing is using the lightest weight possible and just sinking it down, and they pick it up as it's sinking, and it's as simple as that.
What's your opinion of scent?
Scent, I definitely like it for snapper. I mean, I don't use scent a lot of the time, but it always helps, I think, even if it's just to, get the smell of sunscreen from your hands off the lure, or it could be that 1%er. You never know. Like if the bite's tough, I'd definitely try it. And I've used it in the past, and it's worked really, really good. To be honest, I probably should use it more. It's good. I like it. And, those really oily ones, like if you can get a mullet scent, that's really good for snapper.
Oh, yeah, interesting. Which type of scent do you use? Is it Procure?
Yeah, I've used Procure before. I've also used the Squidgy's S Factor, which is a really good one. So I actually don't know. They might not come in specific scents as such. They might these days, I'm not sure. But
No,
yeah,
they just
anything
have
that's
they have just one formula.
yeah, okay, I thought so.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's definitely worked for snapper in the past for me. But yeah, the Procure ones you can get now that are labelled as mullet or prawn, or yeah, they're quite good, and the mullet one's good for sure.
Do you have a preference for jig head hook size?
I tend to just do the rule of thumb where if you're using a 3-inch lure, it's a 3.0 hook.
Yep.
5-inch lure, 5.0 hook. And since we're talking about jig heads, the ones that I like to use for the Z-Mans are the TT headlocks jig heads.
Yep.
And the important thing is, though, with the snapper, they have really hard mouths and they're known for crushing and straightening hooks. So I think those jig heads come in a heavy gauge and a light gauge. So you just got to make sure that you look for the heavy gauge ones and buy those.
Yeah. Now, I'm about to move on and talk about some gear, but I think I want to just touch on possible bycatch. So with everything that we've done that you've explained so far in terms of the baits, the lures, the sorts of areas, the techniques, and, the jig heads, even the rigs, the snell, the 2-hook snell, how would you, what sort of bycatch would you get just using this approach? And if you were to, say, modify it to target a particular bycatch, how would you do so?
Yeah, well, often our bycatch comes where we're just targeting snapper, and as I said, you're floating that bait down slowly, but there's obviously going to be times where you drop it down and you don't get hit by a snapper, and often you make it to the bottom, and if we know we're in a place where there's pearl perch on the bottom, or you're in with a chance of sweet lip and stuff further north at the Sunshine Coast, we don't mind that. We'll fish it for snapper, drop it down slowly, but then when it hits the bottom, we'll just sort of wind it a meter off so we don't get snagged. Drop it back down every now and again just to feel the bottom, and that's where you're going to pick up your species like sweet lip and pearl perch. But once again, it's the same sort of areas where you're fishing for the snapper where you're going to find those species where there's harder reef and broken ground. That's the sort of areas that they love. And the pinnacles as well. Like there was a recent trip we just went on to the Sunshine Coast, and we were catching snapper, and we stopped for lunch and we just happened to drift over a lump of reef that sort of rose up a few meters, and that's where all the bait was holding, and all the predatory fish were just hanging around there as well. So we ended up getting a couple of grassy sweet lip, which was really nice. Even on the soft plastic as it got closer to the bottom. So yeah, it's around the same areas, and anywhere where there's bait is a good area. But often where you have a lump of reef and you might see the bait sitting a lot tighter to the bottom, and you might even see some bigger arches and fish down there. That's when you know to drop your bait down. So if there's fish high in the water column, that's when you want to try and float it down nice and slowly for snapper and possible cobia and things like that. But if there's fish closer to the bottom and bait holding really tight on the reef, that's when you want to sort of get your bait down there as quick as possible. And we often get our bycatch like tusk fish and sweet lip and your more traditional reefies that way.
All right. So that's interesting. So say we want to target one of these bycatch, say the tusk fish, what would you do differently?
Yeah, well, I'd probably just up my sinker or jig head weight a little bit. Definitely if you're fishing with lures, like a soft plastic, you'd want it to get down there a lot quicker. So I'd definitely up that and just get it down near the bottom a lot faster. And same with the sinker on the bait, but you still don't want it too heavy so that it looks unnatural. You still want it to be, a little bit subtle. But yeah, I'd definitely do that and get it straight down there. But also I'd probably look for maybe a little bit different ground. Whereas you can find the snapper over sort of more flat, gravelly bottom at times. The reefies tend to be definitely around bommies and lumps where, you have a rise of really thick, heavy reef and then it might drop off a little bit on either side. And often they'll tuck in around that or, be over the top of it. And often that's where you find bait anyway. So there's usually bigger predatory fish around. So it often pays to have a bit more of a sound around and, look for those. But one thing is if you're struggling to find bait in spots, often you can just go for a bit of a drift and, just have your bait down there. And often you'll drift onto new ground and find fish that way. There's a lot of
Yep.
times where we might be standing around trying to find snapper and bigger schools of bait, and then when we don't, we'll just go for a bit of a drift and see what's happening. And by drifting along the reef, often you find fish as well. You sort of can pick them off on the slower days.
Yeah. What about, say, sweet lip? Is there a difference of approach there?
Yeah, well, often they hang out on a lot harder bottom. I've found, so they're not going to be out over sand a lot. They're going to be on that harder reefier bottom, and they're going to be on the broken ground. But yeah, it's very similar. I mean, we often get those as bycatch when fishing for the snapper. They're one of the biggest bycatches. So just by
Yep.
having your bait down there and having it hard on the bottom is important for those ones. So often they're quite hard to catch without getting snagged sometimes when you're drifting. So it's important just to keep lifting your bait up off the bottom a bit and then dropping it back down every now and again just to feel the bottom and make sure you're close to it. And same with your lures, but they still love a bait dropping down as well, just slowly floating down. They'll often pick it up, but they like it in their face a bit more rather than rising up in the water column to get it.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I was basically thinking about the approach. Say, that there's quite a bit of bycatch, you're fishing this bommy, and that if you go down a little bit too far, you're going to start getting, tusk fish and sweet lip and all sorts. But you're really there just for the snapper. You would keep it a little bit higher in the water column, knowing that the snapper will rise or sit a little bit higher than they would.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing for sweet lip is, they'll eat, the bigger ones will eat live baits and everything, but a lot of people say that they are a fish that you can target with a bit softer bait. So they really like your squid and pilchards and stuff as well.
Yep.
And yeah, with the soft plastics, if you're targeting sweet lip, I'd use the smaller 3-inch ones just because they have that little bit smaller mouth. But we tend to get a lot of our sweet lip on the smaller soft plastics rather than bigger ones. And also on jigs as well, whether it's your smaller octo style jigs with the skirt or a slow pitch jig with a bit of tinsel on the assist hooks. We've caught a fair few sweet lip on that, and often I think it's just that they see the tinsel, the wafting sort of assist hooks, and they come up and have a nibble. So that's another little tip for everyone, just specifically targeting those. You don't want to be working that jig too far off the bottom or that lure. You want it to be just sort of bouncing in their face, where they're going to come along and inspect it.
Yeah, that's a good point there. I'd like to go further into slow pitch jigging. Do you do much of that?
I've just sort of been getting into it a bit. I've caught a few snapper on, as I said, the skirted jigs and smaller slow pitch jigs with assist, the tinsel and dressed assist hooks, I think they call it. But yeah, I think a lot of people get them on more the octa style jigs because they're a bit more subtle. But when the snapper are really fired up, they'll definitely hit a jig worked up through them. So I want to get into that a little bit more. We've had them hit baits and soft plastics when we're just winding them up before, when they're really in a big feeding mode. So I think it'll be definitely fun to get them on the jigs. But I think a big thing is to just change your technique, because obviously jigging is a tiny bit harder than just sinking down a bait or soft plastic. So I think it's good to vary your retrieve, and whether you keep it near the bottom and slowly rise it up and keep letting it flutter down, but maybe retrieve one wind each time, and then just slowly work it up, or whether you jig it a little bit faster, sort of more erratic. I think it's good to just switch up your retrieve and try and figure out what they're feeding on when you're using lures.
Yeah, now I want to just quickly touch on octo jigs. It's not something I've used before. I've done a bit of slow pitch. Definitely one of the more exciting ways to fish, just because of just being actively working the lure and the sorts of gear and areas that you're fishing. You're fishing really deep and suddenly your lure just stops mid-water column. It's just, I can't explain that feeling. When it just straight onto a fish and it's kicking. The first kick is overloading your rod. It's just the best feeling.
Yeah, definitely. It's such a fun way to fish, and in recent years it's getting so popular for those reasons you just said, because, as you said, I think all people that have done it know it's just so fun.
And what about these octopus jigs? How do you... I've never used them.
Yeah, well, I've used them a little bit, and once again, it's a bit interesting because they are usually a little bit heavier and I think meant to be fished closer to the bottom. So we often do get a lot of bycatch on those too, like pearl perch and your sweet lip and stuff like that.
Yep.
But they're really good for snapper when it might be a little bit shut down, and often later in the day or when the snapper aren't biting, they seem to be sitting deeper, like tighter to the structure.
Yep.
Whereas early morning, or if they're really feeding around like a tide change, say, they might be up higher in the water column. So yeah, it's one of those ones where you can fish it a little bit faster, but I think they're meant to be fished really subtly and slow lifts and drops, or a lift, and as it's dropping, you might retrieve one wind and just slowly work it up through the water column. Whereas your slow pitch jigs are, you might be working a little bit faster.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about conditions. So you just mentioned that they might be feeding, in and around the tide change.
Yep.
So if you could describe, say, time, tide, maybe even rainfall, barometric pressure, wind, cloud cover, moon phase, how that all fits in, or whether it doesn't fit into the way that you chase them.
Yeah, well, for starters, I'll talk about the best time to go out and target them when they might be biting. So the big one for snapper is low light conditions, so early morning and late afternoon. And then another really big one is tide changes. So I'm not sure about down in Sydney whether, they might be different where they need some current, as the saying goes, no run, no fun. But on the reefs here offshore, it seems that tide changes, they just seem to go insane some days. And, in the mornings, you'll get a good bite. But then as the sun comes up, they can often switch off pretty quickly, especially in shallower water. But around tide changes, they can come back on. And if you can line up a tide change with an early morning or late afternoon, you often get a really good bite. So what we tend to do is we head out and if we're going to fish shallow water, we fish that first up in the morning while the sun's still behind the horizon in those low light conditions. And then as the sun comes up, we'll move out, maybe to 40 meters or even 60 meters, and they bite later into the morning out in deeper water. So, they're the best times. I mean, in terms of wind, for the techniques that we use, it's harder to fish when the wind is a bit stronger anyway. So, up to 10 knots is sort of okay, but we prefer, 6 and below. I know it's hard to get days like that sometimes, but you just want a nice slow drift, and that way you can float that bait down nice and slowly with a light weight without your line ending up, 100 meters out the back of the boat on a big angle. So that's what we look for, and we even take a sea anchor or drogue out to tie off the back of the boat to slow our drift down some days. So yeah.
What about moon phase or barometric pressure? So we're talking deep water.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. I don't really look at barometric pressure too much. It's one of those things. I know it's important for fishing for species like mangrove jack and Australian bass and things like that, barramundi. But with the snapper, I haven't looked at that too much, especially since we're fishing deep water a lot of the time. But who knows? It could make a difference. But, I try to keep it as simple as possible. And I definitely do look at the moon phase, though, just out of interest, because I think leading up to a moon, whether it's the full or new moon, is often good. The week leading up to it. The day of the moon, especially the full moon, is never really good. I mean, they might feed at night. I've heard of people catching them at night around the full moon, which doesn't happen a lot of other times throughout the cycle. But often the days leading up to it are good, and then maybe a few days after. But that, the time in between, right in the middle there, where the tides get smaller, often it can be a bit tough. You can still catch them, but all the reef species, seem to just start biting at the same time, and it's always usually when you're getting closer to a moon, but not right on it.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, that's just what I've found. I've just sort of started looking at it a lot more, but just from my experience, that's what I've found.
I think a lot of anglers in particular don't like the full moon, like right on that 100% fullness, the bright light, especially at night. But yeah, you wouldn't be alone in thinking that.
Yeah, definitely. I've just sort of started to bust that myth recently. Oh, it's not a myth, it's true in my eyes.
Do you think rainfall has much of an impact?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, after it rains, especially a fair bit, the reefs in close to shore seem to fire up, with snapper, and it could be because there's lots of bait getting flushed out of the estuaries, but they definitely
Yep.
don't mind a little bit of dirty water, and as I said earlier, they are a scavenger, so they will feed around right on the bottom for crabs and prawns and things like that, octopus. So yeah, after rain, those reefs closer to shore seem to fire up a lot. And the other thing that I've found is if we get a few days of really big swell, especially southerly swell pushing in,
Yep.
for some reason the snapper, really come in closer. And there's even, I have a friend who lives on the Gold Coast, and he caught a couple of snapper in the 90 centimetre range inside the bar. So it's just
Well,
one of those things where if you get a really big swell in snapper season, they get pushed right in close. So if there's been a few days or a week of really big swell, it often pays to just, check your marks in close and see if there's any fish in there, because often there is.
yeah, that's a top tip there. That might be why I caught that snapper up the brown water Georges.
Hey, you never know. You said the weather was absolutely battering the river, so who knows what was going on there. But yeah, it could have
That's
been.
right. Now, I don't know all that much about the seasons when it comes to snapper fishing. So how would you explain that to somebody that's getting into it? Like, what's snapper season? When is the bite sort of hard, and when is it sort of time to, maybe target something else?
Yeah, well, in southeast Queensland, it's definitely the cooler months. So, late autumn, they often start getting caught, but they can be caught all year round, even in summer. But they migrate in closer to shore in winter, so there's a lot more around, and they're a lot easier to get in winter. So through winter and spring, definitely good. Late spring, they start moving out into deeper water. First they'll disappear in 30 meters, and people will only be catching them in 40 meters. And then in summer, I do a lot of snapper fishing in 60 to 80 meters. So
Yep.
they definitely still get caught in good numbers out there in summer. But the only thing is, often we get the East Australian current start pushing down in summer, bringing all the pelagics down from up north. And often when that starts going, it's amazing how quickly it runs. And out in 60 and 80 meters, it can be hard to even fish, or actually impossible, because it's running that fast. So, up to December up here anyway, where I am, is good. But
Yep.
I'm not sure about you guys down south. I hear that, down in Victoria and stuff, they're saying that the snapper are just starting to fire up now in summer.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a weird year with 3-4 defined complete flood periods. So it's anybody's guess what the system is doing all along the coast. I mean, the waterway is still in the process of clearing up from the last flood, I think. I mean, it's looking okay, some of the rivers, but they're still not as clear and clean as they should be. So I'm assuming that off the coast, it's still not quite how it should be at this time of year. So we're currently in November, heading into December, so definitely the hotter months. But I would say that the air temperature is starting to warm up, but we're not really getting those really hot temperatures, even in the airways right now.
Yeah,
So it
I
could
know
be a
what
bit
you
of a
mean.
late cold season still, I'd guess.
Yeah, definitely. It's been really weird all up and down the east coast, with floods from Queensland down to Sydney, and yeah, some weird weather going on. That's for sure.
Now let's talk about, just be a little bit specific. So the next actually, let's just talk about the East Australian current. So I definitely have experienced how quickly that's flown, because it literally is when you sit there and you hook up to a fish and the motor's off, you look up and you're about 5 kilometers away from, the FAD, for example. So
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
yeah, so what do you do then? Do you move in closer? I mean, that's the only option you really have. You can't be out there when it's ripping that
Yeah,
hard.
yeah. Well, honestly, we get very disappointed by it some days because, some years all the way through December we can go out there and still fish for snapper, but then other years we'll head down there in December and go all the way 20 kilometers out and get there and just can't fish, and it's disappointing because you have no choice but to turn around and come in a bit closer. And we often come into another reef system, the next one in, which is around 40 to 45 meters deep, and
Yep.
often it's a bit better in there. But the thing is, it can be tougher, and there aren't as many snapper in there during summer. They've all moved out.
Yep.
But yeah, it's just one of those things where here in southeast Queensland, anyway, I know that once that current comes in, sometimes that's it for the year. You might not get back out until autumn again,
Yeah, that makes
because the
sense.
current's just too hard, and even when you have your neap tides, I guess, it's
Yep.
still out. Just as you said, you look up and you realize when you're going back up to your mark that you're a couple of kilometers away, and all you've done is had one drop, and you're just going, "Are you kidding me?" So yeah, it's just one of those things where you can't really fish for snapper properly, over those summer months sometimes, but they are still there, and you can still catch them up until at least December here off the Gold Coast anyway.
Yes, that's good. So there's still a bit of a window for those listening in right now. If you're after that big snapper, we're only towards the tail end of November, so a little bit of a small window.
Yeah,
But let's
definitely.
move on into tackle. So tackle,
Yes.
rods, reels, lines, leaders.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the most basic setup. So the line that we're using and setups often is just 20-pound braid and 20-pound leader, fluorocarbon leader. So that's a pretty good starting point because you can still land your other reef fish on that. You can still catch good sized snapper on that, and if you get bycatch of other bigger species, you've still got a chance as well. Um, the lightest we fish is actually with our soft plastics. Sometimes we fish with 12-pound braid and 14-pound leader, and that's really good fun. So snapper are a species that will take you into the reef, but often we don't get taken into the reef too often on even that lighter gear. So
Yep.
it's just a bit of fun, and you're in trouble if you hook a big fish like a cobia or something, but it's good fun and yeah, very sporting, and it probably even helps having that lighter leader. Snapper can be a bit finicky like brim sometimes, I guess.
Yep.
And then the heaviest we go in terms of line is probably 30-pound for snapper, and that's what you fish a lot for the bigger ones. And maybe if you were dropping down a live bait trying to get one of those really trophy snapper, so a lot of people fish with mono line. I mean, that's probably good because snapper are a fish that do really hard runs and violent head shakes, and with such a hard mouth, often you can pull the hooks. But if you're running braid and just run a nice smooth drag, often you're okay.
Yep. Now, just a quick passing question here. Say you want to catch a really big snapper. What bait would you use?
I'd be definitely using a bigger bait. So I'd use maybe even a whole yakka or a live yakka or
Live yakka, yep.
Half a slimy mackerel. I mean, live is definitely the go for the bigger snapper.
Yep.
Whether you're fishing in close, and often they'll get hit on the drop too sometimes, but often you're fishing those a bit closer to the bottom, and the big fish will definitely find those that are mooching around maybe a bommy or a bit of gravel, that they're going to pick out that live and come and smash it.
Yep. Now, back to the gear. So we're at about 20-pound on the, general sort of general purpose fishing, 30-pound if you're really going hard at it, trying to get a big model. So definitely very finesse in your approach, which fits into, the lures and the baits and the way, you weight them with as light a jig head and as light a sinker as possible. What about like rods and reels? Is there anything specific there? And what line ratings are we talking about?
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that because obviously with your lures you can use spin gear, but with the bait we actually like to use overhead reels. So
Yep.
your rod is just to match your line. So if we're using 20-pound line, we're using a 6 to 10 kilo rod, say, so around 20 pounds. But but yeah, the reels with the bait fishing, we like to actually use overheads, and that's simply because when you're dropping that bait down and they're going to be hitting it on the drop, you just have a lot more feel over it. Having your
Yep.
thumb on the spool and slowly floating it down, you can feel when they pick it up, and also you can control how fast your bait's dropping as well. With a spin reel, you can still do it, but often you might miss that bite because as it's coming off the spool, it's making the rod tip dance around, and you can hold it between your thumb and forefinger, but it's still just not the same. And
Yep.
when you get a bite on the overhead, all you have to do is click that reel into gear, engage it, and strike pretty much. So
Straight into it. Yeah.
yeah, that's one of the funnest parts of snapper fishing for me is the strike. When you're dropping down, just anticipating it, and then next minute you just feel them absolutely smash it and start to run off, and you set that reel into gear, and it's just on for young and old.
Yeah, that's the best feeling.
Definitely.
Any sorts of brands?
I just keep it pretty simple. So I really like Penn. They're really good reels. And I've just been using a Shimano TLD 20.
Yep.
So that's the reason is because I use the similar setups that I use for snapper for mackerel in summer. So that fits a lot of line on it. I think it's got 500 meters of braid or something, but also it's good reel with smooth drag. That's the most important thing for me with snapper fishing. So just a nice smooth drag, and then with the soft plastics, I actually use an Abu Garcia spin reel, just a 4000. Just once again, nice smooth drag, and with their big head shakes and runs, it's really important because if you don't have that smooth drag, you're going to be pulling hooks. Snapper have really hard mouths, and that hook's just going to pop straight out.
Yeah, like you said, they have very vicious, sharp head shakes as well. So it doesn't help. It just compounds to the problem if you're not forgiving in any part of your system, whether it's with the rod or with the smoothness of drag.
Yeah, definitely, mate. Definitely.
Any brands that you use when it comes to lines and leaders that you recommend?
Well, I've just been using Berkeley Fireline, to be honest. So, I mean, if you're going to be fishing deeper water, you want to try and get something a bit thinner, and that's why the braid's good compared to mono, because it's going to, cut through the water better, and, you won't have as much of a belly in your line as you're trying to drop your bait down. But yeah, honestly, if you're casting, you might want a bit more, what's the word? Specific casting braid, a bit smoother, but yeah.
Yep.
But if you're just dropping your baits down, you don't need to worry about that too much. You just want something nice and strong, nice and smooth, and just as thin as possible for floating your baits down pretty much.
Yeah, that does make a difference. When you're fishing very light, having a braid that's not too thick and doesn't catch into the current as much, it's just going to let you to slip that bait down as quickly as possible.
Yeah, definitely. And if you want me to be honest, I'm not afraid to say that even on one of my snapper rods, I was using braid that I bought at Aldi, the grocery store, when they had a fishing sale one time. And
right.
It's had no problems whatsoever. So there you go for anyone listening. You don't need anything super expensive to go out and catch snapper. As long as it's quality, it's all good.
Now, let's say that you had to recommend a beginner on purchasing a combo for this sort of fishing. Can you identify, say, a rod and reel that they could purchase, at a cheap price?
Yeah, okay. Well, I know that for the soft plastics and lures, the good old Shimano Raiders, a rod like that is, they're really popular and really good rods for it. They're nice and sensitive. You sort of want a graphite rod for that. So that's a sort of setup where you do want to make sure that you've got a nice rod and reel setup.
Yep.
So yeah, definitely that, and maybe any sort of mid-range Shimano reel or Penn, Abu Garcia, anything like that. I currently have an Abu Garcia Pro Max, I think they're called.
Yep.
In just a 4,000 or 5,000 size is perfect. So they're just nice quality, smooth drag, tough reels. Anything like that's fine. And then for your overheads, it sort of just depends on what you want to do. But I know there's Penn makes some really good ones. Shimano have their TLDs, anything like that. You can even get the smaller profile sort of bait caster ones now that are made for jigging and floating down bigger baits out on the reef. So yeah, anything like that. And in terms of a rod, once again, you can go graphite, or we've even caught them on the good old ugly sticks and stuff like that. But anything like that around 6 to 10 kilos is good.
Perfect. I think, as you said, the Shimano Raiders, that's been on the market for who knows how long now. So they've lasted for a good while, and for good reason. And I think they're pretty cheap. They're under $100 or there or thereabouts, even at full RRP. So yeah, that would definitely be some. So say a 6 to 10 kilogram and a 4,000 reel, and they're set, at least for spin gear. All right, Will. So many tips so far, but I think a lot of anglers here are looking to keep their catch, and I was wondering if you had any tips on how to look after one if you were going to keep it for a feed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we love to eat the snapper, so they're one of the tastiest species we get up here, that's for sure. So a big one is as soon as you get it on board, you might want to get a photo quickly, but the next thing you want to do is bleed it. So I know with your pelagic species like mackerel and tailor and things like that, it's important to bleed them, but it's even important to bleed snapper, because we've realized that the eating quality when you bleed them is just that much better. They come out so clean. So you want to bleed it straight away and let that drain out in a bucket of water maybe, and then you want to get it straight into a really nice cold ice slurry. So that probably sounds basic, but it's just amazing how clean and tasty the meat is after you do that. And then you want to keep it nice and cool, as I said, and then fill it. Don't let it get too warm or anything. And it's just really, really nice fish.
Fantastic. Now let's go through what it involves to go out on a day chasing snapper. I want all the details, the good bits, the funny bits, the gory bits, starting from the night before. Yeah,
well, the night before, usually I'll sit down and I'll be rigging up the lines, because Dad's getting a bit older. He needs his glasses just to tie a blood knot. So I've usually tied about 10 by the time he's got one done. But no, it's good to just sit there and tie the lines up, maybe watch a couple of videos, and we make a plan, which, usually something goes wrong in that plan. But no, we make a bit of a plan, and, what we're going to do, where we're going to go first, what we're going to try. Then, the next morning we'll have the boat all fueled up. Everything's ready. We'll just pack it. And I actually live about an hour inland from the coast, so we get up early and drive down. Then we get out there, try to remember to put the bungs in and not forget anything. You don't want to sink the boat before you even go. But no, we get out there, and often that runs pretty smoothly because we fish together a lot of the time. It's we get it done pretty quick, and we get out there, which is good. It's often dark when we get out there, so we'll often just take a drift to set everything up, and Dad might put a bait down. He usually catches the biggest fish of the day straight up before I've even got a line out. That's usually how it goes.
And, fair enough.
Yeah, but then honestly, we'll fish hard early, try and get them as that sun's coming up. And then, if they go off the bite, we'll make a bit of a plan. We might try another spot. We just enjoy the day. We do fish pretty hard because, when they're biting, you want to be right on top of them.
Yep.
So we fish pretty hard, and after it's all done, we usually have a good day either way, no matter what. Something usually goes wrong, whether it's dropping something over the side of the boat, or I don't know, something usually goes wrong, getting sharked or something, losing a big fish. But that's all part of the fun. We often we have some really good memories fishing, so we absolutely love it. And then we'll often come back, clean the boat together, look after all our gear, and fill up the fish up and have a feed with the family. So myself, my brother, and then mum and dad. It's that's what it's all about, really. We absolutely love it, and it's one of our favourite forms of fishing to do, that's for sure.
Awesome, Will Kitching. Look, I'm going to bring the podcast home, and I think a lot of people listening in would like to follow your journey. So what are some of your socials?
Yeah, well, my YouTube is just my name, Will Kitching. So it's like kitchen, but ing on the end. And I'm almost at 5,000 subscribers, and I do plenty of videos over there. So make sure you go check it out. I give plenty of tips as well on different species and plenty of action. My Instagram is willkitching.yt. And I also have a Facebook page, which is just Will Kitching Fishing. So if you want to go check those out, and feel free to flick me a message on there as well if you have any inquiries or questions. I'm always happy to answer or even give you a call on the phone quickly and talk to you about any questions you have. So for all listening, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I just want to say a big thank you to you, Shroom, for having me on. It's been a pleasure, mate, and it's been great talking to you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Will. And I was going to say, yeah, these socials and all the links that you've just mentioned, they're going to be on the description. If you're watching from YouTube, it's going to be there. It's also going to be there on the description of Spotify and the podcast platform. So you'll be able to find him. And is there anyone else that you'd like to thank?
Oh, probably just my family and my dad. I wouldn't be able to go on a lot of these fishing adventures without them and without him, that's for sure. So I'm very, very lucky. And Dad will be watching this probably. So he's pretty much taught me a lot of it, and we've learned a lot of it together. So yeah, very thankful for him. And big thank you to anyone who supports me and follows me on YouTube and everything as well. So I really appreciate you guys. So thanks so much.
Excellent. All right, ladies and gents, we're going to wrap up the podcast here. So that's Southeast Queensland, East Coast Australia, fishing for snapper and bycatch with Will Kitching. So this is a Shroom signing out.